What it do? Yo man, listen. Today, I want to explain my thought process when it comes to predicting what characters come to Tacticus. Let's get right into it. Recently, I made a video about the Emperor's Children and what the faction might look like when it eventually arrives in Tacticus. In that video, I gave myself quite a bit of credit because of my good track record of guessing characters correctly. And I'm not saying this to brag or anything. I just do, like, statistically have a good track record for making these predictions. I was right about the entirety of the Tau faction. I was right about the entirety of the World Leaders faction. I was right about the entirety of the Dark Angels faction. I was right about 4/5 of the Tyranids faction. My only mistake is the Tyrant Guard. I own up to that. However, I don't make these correct predictions thanks to some insider knowledge or some super crazy secret methodology. This video, I want to genuinely explain how I go about making the predictions I do, so you can also, theorize, because it's fun. Think of it as a teaching to fish instead of giving fish. My first criteria when making predictions for factions and characters is codexes and indexes. In tabletop, in 10th edition currently, which is the current edition, there are factions who have codexes, there are factions who have indexes, and there are factions who have neither. I think factions who have codexes and indexes are more likely to come to Tacticus than factions that have neither. Right now on tabletop, an example of a faction we currently don't have in Tacticus is Leagues of Votann. They had a codex last edition, in 9th edition, and they currently have an index. They will more than likely get a codex some point in 10th edition. I think they are more likely to come to Tacticus than something like Salamanders, because Salamanders have neither a codex nor an index. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. For example, Emperor's Children technically have an index that is extremely lackluster. It's only 4 pages. However, it's been confirmed that they're going to be getting a codex sometime in 2025. That's why I think it's highly likely that we will see them at some point in 2025, especially because there's going to be a lot of hype surrounding the faction, and what better time to introduce it when the hype's at its peak. When it comes to characters, there are many factors when considering what gets added. Certain factions have different criteria. I did go over this in my Emperor's Children prediction video, where I think Monogod Chaos factions are significantly easier to predict. Monogod Chaos factions being the, Death Guard, which only pray to Nurgle, World Leaders, which only play to Khorne, sorry, Khorne is the Space Marine, and the Thousand Sons, which only pray to Zeech. I think they have the common thread of always having a god representative, always having a character that represents faction identity, and always having a Terminator of some sorts. However, with that being said, I think every single faction can be boiled down to 4 criteria. These are iconicness, identity, new models, and size. The most straightforward one is size. Currently in the game, the biggest thing we have that is playable to us players is either Snapareka or Revas. Now, these are models who both have 55mm bases. It's pretty, reasonably sized. Smaller than a Rhino, but significantly bigger than your average Eldar character. However, because they are the biggest size, I don't feel comfortable saying we'll get something like really big. I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, we'll get Norn Emissary and whatnot. While I think that will be extremely cool from a gameplay standpoint, and Norn Emissary is absolutely humongous, so I don't think it's realistic to expect it to come to Tacticus. Another criteria is new. Hot take, I've been told Draupnir's gonna drop the biggest hot take ever. No, hot take, I think Games Workshop wants to sell models, so it would make sense for them to promote these newer models in Tacticus, right? It makes perfect sense. For example, Ascor the 8-bound and Macer the Jackal They were both models that got released last year. No, not sometime in it towards the end of ninth edition. Time is kind of fuzzy. Where they were completely new models, and they are a big part of the faction in Tacticus, right? 2/5 of the models are new models. Asmodai is another example. Despite being an older model, he did get a new cast for his model, and this was very close to the time where it actually released in Tacticus, right? So there was a little bit of an overlap there. Titus is an example of this to some extent, where he was made to promote the Space Marine 2 release event, right? It's a whole connection, or interconnected web of promotion, right? Tacticus does the Space Marine 2 event, Space Marine 2 game comes out, Games Workshop releases the Lieutenant Titus model. It all goes together. The last part is iconicness and identity. I think this is a little hard to explain, not because it's like a super difficult, complex thing, it's just my English is not sufficient enough to do so. However, essentially, it boils down to when you play enough tabletop or engage with a critical mass of 40k content, be it animation, be it shows, be it books, or maybe, watching YouTube videos of people covering the lore, certain things start to pop up when you hear a faction mentioned. For example, when someone says world leaders, someone who reads the lore, someone who plays the tabletop, the first thing that'll come to their mind is a world leader's berserker or a Karn the Betrayer. Karn is essentially a berserker. Or when you go to a Genestealer cult player and you say, hey, like, what's your faction leader? They're gonna say the Patriarch. Now, this is very common. This is the same reason why I am predicting you're going to get Commander Dante in Blood Angels. However, this does clash with the new model thing, because despite the fact that Commander Dante getting a new model last edition, we did get 2 new Blood Angels models not too long ago. However, in my personal opinion, Sanguinary Guard and Commander Dante are massive parts of the Blood Angels identity, and I think Tacticus does a good enough job reflecting the tabletop and lore identity in the game. That's why I think we're going to get something like Dante. Now, Dante isn't a massive model, so the size is fine. He does have a newer model, which is also fine. They did get their codex not too long ago, and iconic, there's nothing more iconic than Dante. And identity, as I mentioned, the Sanguinary Guard and whatnot. Now, ease of prediction, this is not equal for every single faction. It's a fact that certain factions are much easier to predict than other factions. For example, Eldar and Genestealer cults are absolute nightmares to predict because they have 10 million characters that could get added to Tacticus, right? They are iconic enough, they are small enough, they represent the identity as a faction of a whole. Like, it's a very big faction, so it's difficult to guess. Genestealer cults have something like 14 characters on tabletop, not counting like actual units, because we do get those. For example, Bellators and Inceptor, that's not a character, that's just a unit that's been added. So those 2 factions specifically are extremely difficult to get. Sometimes new model releases can skew the predictions. A great example is Blood Angels. I think the 5th character is going to be Dante, but it can be one of the 2 models that got released not too long ago, right? There's no way of knowing. And sometimes, this only happens for the Tyrannus faction, I do, despite it only happening once, I do feel the need to mention it. My own wants and desires can cloud my judgment. A great example of this is the Tyrant Guard, because I was so sure that we were going to get a Hive Tyrant that I was like, there's no way we're getting something else, right? Because like, this isn't because I had like knowledge, because I mean, of course I didn't have knowledge, he's not in the game, but it was just, I really like Tyrants on tabletop. They're one of my favorite models in the game. They're one of my favorite things to play in Crusade. So I really wanted them to come, so I convinced myself that they would come. However, I didn't take into account that certain models are more fitting to the criteria that characters fulfill to get added to Tacticus. Of course, this criteria is made by me. It's just me predicting. As for accuracy, now there are two ways of interpreting accuracy. First one is lore accurate. I think it's very silly to expect anything being lore accurate in Tacticus, and even the tabletop for that matter, because if things were lore accurate, Custodes will just win every single game and it will not even be close. In tabletop, right, which is quote unquote similar to the lore, Custodes are just slightly tougher than Terminators. And that's not the case in lore. Another thing for accuracy is the things, the units, the characters representing what they are on tabletop. Now, I do think this does help making predictions. What I mean by this is when they're adding a Deathwing Terminator, I can look at the tabletop and confidently say, it's like, hey, this Deathwing Terminator is not gonna have 4 movement. It's not gonna be flying around doing psychic damage. It's gonna do similar things to a Deathwing Terminator on tabletop. It's gonna be slow. It's gonna be durable. More than likely, it is going to have a plasma gun, because plasma was a massive part of the Dark Angel's identity in 8th edition. They had like a whole stratagem called Weapons from Dark Age, which increased plasma damage and whatnot. That's how I can predict, right? Because I did say, hey, we're gonna get a Deathwing Terminator. It's gonna have plasma. It's gonna be tough. Because those are the things. Like Deathwing Terminators are very iconic when it comes to Dark Angels. They even have their own game. It's called Space Hulk. It is extremely buggy. I've been told that Draupnir convinced his friends to download Space Hulk. They all paid a lot of money, and then the game will just not function. It's a true story, by the way. No, but that's how I can make predictions. It's just looking at the tabletop and looking at lore. Not lore, but like rules and stuff. There are resources such as Wahapedia, which explain what stuff does on tabletop, and I think those are good resources when making predictions. When someone says, oh, I can't wait for the Turbigon to be added as a playable character, once again, I think it'll be really fun if they had the Turbigon as a playable character. I just don't think it's realistic. Anyways, thank you very much for watching the video. I really appreciate you doing so. Have a great day, and stay safe.